So welcome everyone to the final of our three-part webinar series on collaborating with carbon. Today we are joined by, and a huge welcome to our panellists, Matt Downs, Dr. James Sipo and Lorraine Gordon. This webinar explores the topic of understanding market mechanisms, making money from environmental stewardship programs, and looks at the different opportunities for maximising the value of your farm as an environmental asset from biodiversity to carbon. Today we will continue to consider the best ways to access available carbon in your farm for economic and environmental benefit. Farmers are set to be the supplier of environmental goods and services using programs such as the carbon credit market and biodiversity offsets. As these markets grow in volume, scope and scale, it's important that farmers get fair access. Today we'll be looking at the potential for more farmers to gain access to a fairer deal from the environmental goods and services market through understanding the market mechanisms that understand these programs. The structure of today's webinar is that each of our panellists will share their thoughts and opinions on this topic based on their experience and expertise. Following this, we will hold a panel discussion through a Q&A invitation to the audience. Thank you for all keeping your mics off during the initial presentations. While people are presenting, you're welcome to comment or ask questions in the chat box. And we would love to see you, so you are invited to have your cameras on during the presentation if you would like to. You can change your displayed name using the three dots next to your name on the screen. And if you like, you can add your location so we know where you're coming from today. During the panel discussion Q&A, if you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and you can turn on your microphone, or you can just pop your question in the chat. And just be aware that this webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Farming Together website in the coming weeks. And without further ado, okay, and thanks for the heads up in the chat as well. Our first panelist is all about collaboratively bringing practical knowledge to the fore, along with input from theory and research. It's my pleasure to introduce Lorraine Gordon, Director of Strategic Projects at Southern Cross University. Lorraine is the founder of the National Regen Ag Alliance, affectionately known as RAH, based out of Southern Cross University, and is known for acting as a conduit between industry and research, delivering sustainable and regenerative agricultural solutions nationally. Lorraine has assisted over 30,000 farmers, fishers and foresters around the country to progress collaborative projects and establish cooperatives as Director of the Farming Together program. At heart and at the core of what she does, Lorraine is a carbon farmer and holistic beef cattle trader at Ebor in the New England tablelands of New South Wales, where she uses timed controlled grazing methods to turn off up to 1,000 steers per annum. A graduate of the Australian Rural Leadership Program and previous New South Wales ABC Rural Woman of the Year, Lorraine is currently completing her PhD in Ecological Economics through UNE, looking at triple bottom line comparisons between regen and conventional grazing systems. Lorraine, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Oh, hang on, I've got my mute off. Fantastic. Thanks, Simone. Hi, everyone. Great to have both James and Max with us today, who I believe are experts in this field. I'm just going to talk very briefly today, and as always, when I do a presentation, I like to come from a very pragmatic point of view based on my own experience, and then couple that with a little bit of technical stuff on the top. So just kicking off, we've already done some discussions now, a couple of webinars around carbon farming, soil carbon farming, and realising the value around soil carbon farming. If you do remember, for those that have been on our other webinars, this particular diagram, which shows different options for realising value, and that was around the carbon side of things. If we just go down to point 5, you'll see that we talk about this area of carbon plus, where you can actually start to tell a bigger story to potential investors in this space around your biodiversity story, around the fact that you might not only be a soil carbon farmer, but you may also be a biodiversity farmer, in that you'll be looking at offsetting someone else's footprints or perhaps your own, and also selling biodiversity credits. So that's the area we're really going to be focusing on today. And that's where it sits in that original diagram that that I showed you from our previous webinars. And apologies for those that weren't on those previous webinars. You can still, I believe, get them because they've been taped, and you can download those and have a look. So biodiversity credits, what are they? What are they about? There's a bit of a definition. In our case, we have a farm up at Ebor in the New England Tablelands. We use all parts of our farm for cattle grazing and tourism, but we also have a function centre that sits on absolute pristine country that is not farmed at all. And it's surrounded by about 70 hectares of virgin forest and grasslands with some incredible biodiversity. We have sphagnum moss, sphagnum frogs, all sorts of botanicals, all sorts of rare flowers and pines along the riverbanks, and all sorts of interesting both plant and animal species on that property. So from our point of view, we are carbon farmers on our farm. So we're registered with the Emissions Reduction Fund as carbon farmers, and we are undertaking carbon farming. But also we can actually add to that story by being involved with the biodiversity credits and biodiversity offsets and credits for those that might have developments elsewhere that need to offset their footprint. So what we're actually doing is setting up our farm to be able to tell a story, and whether we make money out of those biodiversity credits and offsets or not, we're still enhancing our story to potential investors that may want to buy our credits down the track. So that's the reasoning behind why our family farm started to look at this particular space. And there are a few issues around that, because technically we can't graze the area that we're using for biodiversity offsets and credits. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So very quickly, and I don't want to talk for too long, two types of credits: ecosystem credits and species credits. And so you'll find that with our rare and endangered species, if people are doing, if organisations or companies are doing a particular, like building highways or some sort of construction, and they're going to affect an endangered species, they need to be able to offset what's going to happen to that species by buying species credits from somewhere else. And koalas are a very good example of that with the Pacific Highway development. Ecosystem credits are actually protecting a whole environmental community, so an ecological community, and aren't so much about the species, but more about the community and what that community is, if that is an endangered community environmentally. So two different types, both very relevant. It really depends, horses for courses, so to speak, on what that footprint is going to look like by that organisation or that company. So how does it work? Basically, organisations that are doing the construction work, whatever that might be, when they are offsetting that development, they need to be able to purchase those credits off landowners. And it's not until they've completely offset their footprint can those credits then hit the open market and the farmer then get paid from other sources. And the boys might be able to talk more about that, the logistics of how that works, because I haven't actually been involved with the trading of those credits to date. So it is based on the theory that biodiversity values gained at the offset site will compensate for biodiversity values lost to the development at another location. And the fact that those credits need to be offset before they can then go onto the open market to continue to be traded. So, and that's what they call this total fund deposit. So the money of the sale of the credits from the biodiversity stewardship site is used to fund the management of that site in perpetuity. So the management of that site may include things like weed control, pest control. It may include planting new species or replacing native species, but it doesn't include farming as a general practice. And that's the big difference between the carbon side that we've talked about previously. And so when the total fund deposit is fully paid, the money from the additional sale of credits from a biodiversity stewardship site is paid directly back to the farmer. So look, just a few of the points that I've experienced in our situation when we went down this path. Understand that this is a state government legislation. Queensland is way ahead of us in this space, I believe. But in New South Wales, it is the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment and managed by the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. There are different grades. So when I first looked into this and met with the department, they mapped my property to work out how far away was I from a major development. And unfortunately, well, I mean, probably good on the other hand, where our property is located in the New England tablelands up at Ebor, it was not near any major development. And so the grade to them in offsetting somebody's construction footprint or mining footprint or whatever it might be was not as highly regarded as, for instance, an area that's right on top of a development. And that's why it's going to be really good to hear from Max today, because being out close into the western suburbs of Sydney, that area has had massive development happening, massive construction, new airports going, a new airport going in, highways, subdivisions, you name it. And so therefore it's right on their doorstep. And they would be considered a very high grade area to be able to offset somebody else's footprint. So in our case, we weren't. So the magic rule then was around about 100 kilometres from a major development, puts you into that higher grade. You can't continue to farm in the sense of how you farm. So you can't graze cattle through those areas, which is unfortunate. And this hopefully will change into the future because, as we know, and we've discussed previously, regenerative grazing techniques such as time control grazing can be really beneficial to pastures, native pastures and native species if it's managed right. So I think that one is up for debate, but at this point in time, that's not how this particular scheme works. You can, however, be paid to undertake weed and pest control and further native species planting. So basically, the other upside about going down this path is you're protecting an area on your property as a biodiversity sink, so to speak. And what that can also do is attract moisture to your whole farm. It's like a mini bioregion in itself, that if you have this protected area that you choose not to farm, it's like the heartbeat of the whole farm, and it can therefore attract moisture across the property. If there is rain clouds around, they will accumulate around that biodiversity area. So it has huge benefits to the overall sustainability, I guess, of your farming enterprise. So that's something to keep in mind, which is secondary to the money side of things, but in fact essential if you want to be a regenerative farmer and sustainable into the future. So look, that's me done. Happy to take questions either now or at the end of the panel session. Simone?
Yeah, we might just wait till the end, Lorraine.
Okay.
Yeah, great. There are a few in there already though, so we will come back to your questions, and thanks, do keep posting them in the chat. Secondly, today we have Max Downs, the businessman and finance manager at Brownlow Hill, a heritage-listed 6th-generation working farm on the outskirts of Western Sydney. Originally a dairy farm, Max's parents and family diversified into a number of areas, including what Max now manages, the farm's biodiversity banking initiative. In 2010, Brownlow Hill became a pilot project for the Biodiversity Banking and Offset Scheme. Currently, they're working on a 6th site on the property where Max focuses on the business behind the operation and manages these 6 Biodiversity Stewardship Agreements. With a Bachelor of Agricultural and Economics and a Master's in Financial Planning, it is a pleasure to introduce Max Downs as a forerunner in the Biodiversity Offset Scheme. Thank you very much, Max.
Thank you very much. I'll just see if I can share my screen. So yeah, I'm just going to basically be expanding a little bit on what was just said there. So yeah, I'm just going to be talking about these stewardship agreements and how beneficial they've been for our family farm, the environment, and sort of the mechanics of how they make money. As said, Brownlow Hill, we've been here since 1828. Our family, as a bit of background, got here in 1859. We were recently a dairy farm, but yeah, falling milk prices and sort of priced us out a bit. And we now have beef and lucerne on about 2/3 of the farm, and the other third we are locking up under the Biodiversity Stewardship Agreements. We've done 6 of these so far. My parents, as well as my 2 siblings and our respective partners, we all live on the farm together. So today's talk, so I just basically in 2 parts, the mechanics of the stewardship agreements, and then secondly, the sort of why it makes sense to do them, I suppose. So yeah, this has sort of been covered a bit already, but basically, as said, like a developer to get an approval for a development, they need to offset the bushland effectively that they're bulldozing or clearing to get an approval. BSA is a development scheme backed by the state government that allows landowners to be paid for locking up portions of their farm by that same developer. The offsets are established on a like-for-like basis, meaning we're Cumberland Plain woodland here. So if a developer knocking down Cumberland Plain woodland, that's every part of the state has a different sort of ecological community, and those need to be offset like for like. So how does it work? So put simply, you basically want to find a parcel of land that's greater than about 25 acres. Anything less than that, we've found that in our experience, the economics of it just don't work. Get an ecological consultant who specialises in these agreements to give you a desktop sort of survey, or a back of the envelope calculation is what we sort of can think of them as. And they'll be able to give you a ballpark of how many credits that land is worth and what those credits have sold for recently. And if that gets into into the sort of sweet spot of it working, then you complete the assessment, which is a bit of a cost, but sort of worthwhile. You generate the credits, sell the credits. The land is locked down in perpetuity, and then you proceed to undertake the management actions. So the ongoing management as a condition, so as part of like generating these credits, you get a big 130-page document with lots of great detail about how about the state of your ecology in the site, and it also includes a management plan. So each year you are obligated to go out and undertake parts of that management plan, and that's set out over a 20-year period. As sort of mentioned, this is mainly just getting rid of feral pests, exotic trees, and planting, basically. So who pays for this work? Well, the best way to sort of explain that, I think, is to go into a proper example. So let's say, for example, you have 35 hectares or acres, and it generates for you 100 credits. You decide as a landowner, you're willing to lock that land down for $2 million, and you price the credits accordingly. So you know that that's your hurdle rate. That's what you want to make, at least, to make it worthwhile for you to then lock something down in perpetuity. You then go about finding a buyer or a few buyers until all your credits are sold. And then this is just totally an example, but the first 800,000 of that potentially will go into the total fund deposit, which you are the owner of. And that 800,000 number will increase or decrease depending on how much work there is to be done to that site. If there's more work to be done, a lot more trees, that 800,000 might be up at 1.1 million, say. And then the idea being that that fund will then pay you once a year to get the help that you require to do the work to get it back to a good native bushland state. So in this example, 800K goes into that TFD, and then that other 1.2 comes to you in cash, and that has big implications. Then, as I said, the total fund deposit pays you each year, which covers the work you'll need to do. Minimising the amount that goes into the TFD by doing the work up front has always been our strategy. The Biodiversity Conservation Trust have recently sort of become a middleman to this process. That's because they want to create an environment that is a little bit easier for the developers, so they can pay straight to the BCT rather than having to look around for farmers who have got these credits, because these big building projects are on, very tight. They cost them thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars a day, in machinery. So they needed a more efficient system. So they've got the opportunity now to pay directly to the BCT, and then the BCT will then go out to market to all its network of landowners, and will look to buy the credits that it's sold previously to make sure that that you get the ecological outcome that's intended. Unfortunately, this has established a price ceiling for different credit types. The BCT basically, because they have to come up with a price for those credits that they're selling before they're buying. So they've got a huge econometric model that basically takes into things like opportunity cost of land value, the recent credit sales, all sorts of stuff, and that generates a price per credit. So as a landowner, there hasn't been many. We personally haven't sold any to the BCT yet, which we find a bit strange. But we do most of our deals just dealing directly with developers. You can establish a bit of a network, but basically the price that you charge when approaching like a big development company like a Lend Lease or the state government building a highway, whatever, is basically just to go slightly lower than that the BCT is offering. You want to sort of get that as close as possible to that price. And then how to think about credit price. So the way we think about it is, obviously it's a big, perpetuity is a long time. So we think about the value of the land and then what it will be worth in 5 years, and then try to price the credits accordingly off of that. So for example, if we had a 20 hectare site valued at $1 million on recent real estate prices, or we get a valuer out to come and have a look, you then look at how many credits you will receive. And if, for example, you get 5 credits per hectare, so 100 credits in total, at $10,000 per credit, would be your absolute minimum, because at that point you've got a decision. It's an even decision between, and this is strictly in revenue terms, whether you sell the land or you sell the credits of the land. So you are locking this thing up in perpetuity. So you actually want to charge a bit of a premium on that, because that optionality of the land is sort of being reduced. So you maybe charge $12,000 for those credits. As explained, the first $500,000 of those will go into the total fund deposit. And then, so in that example, you'd end up with 500 in the total fund deposit and 700 in cash for yourself. But importantly, if your credits per hectare is less than 5, you'll need to charge more per credit, which may or may not be hard. But so that going back to that thing where I said we do a lot of the work up front, that is to ensure that the credits per hectare is at a good value. And that's something that we rely on our ecological consultants a lot for, and they help us a lot with. So yeah, you want to get into what we sort of think of as the sweet spot. So you have enough. You want to get enough credits that you are beneath the BCT's price ceiling, and the expected revenue from all those credits is more than the opportunity cost of the future value of that land. And if those two things line up, then it makes sense to do it. Keeping in mind that the BCT prices change quite frequently, and the market, it was mature, then the system sort of got changed recently. So it's back in immature, I'd say. And so finding the price, there's still a lot of price discovery going on. So even if you go away and do this work and decide that it's not quite worth it yet, then it might be still in a couple of years' time as a few sales go through and that BCT formula sort of starts to work a bit more favourably. And then finally, why this is important for our family. We are sort of close to Sydney here, so we've got a bit of an existential sort of fear of them trying to build a highway through us, and I'm sure, like with any of the any farmers, sort of like sort of are worried about that. So this just provides us with a little bit of legislative protection. We think it creates liquidity. So we say that you're selling the farm without having to sell the farm. You're still the legal owner of it. You're just restricted by how much you can do with the land, but and it creates the liquidity so that you can put then into unemotional and uncorrelated assets. And this, like a massive problem with farmers, and I'm sure everyone who can tell a sad story about a farm being broken up or siblings fighting and losing that farm, and then the farm losing the economies of scale that it needs to survive. So this for us is, instead of dividing up the farm, we've created this liquidity event that then we can divide capital rather than the farm, which then impacts the operations too badly. And then also on that sort of succession intergenerational point, the optionality of the land is gone, and it's whether that's considered a bug or a feature. We consider it a feature just because me and my siblings will all have kids soon, so it's probably going to be 10 kids running around here, all with equal love for the place, hopefully, and they won't. there's no chance that they will have conflict over what to do with the land, because that fate is sealed. And the capital from that is now in an unemotional asset, which is a lot more flexible than land. Finally, it's just a great thing to do for the environment. As described, it does I like that analogy that was mentioned just before, that it's the heartbeat of the farm. It draws moisture into it for sure, and you can, it has these other sort of benefits. Yeah, and then finally, if the goal of a farmer is to leave the property better than when you received it, then this is a great way to do it, and make some money in the process. That's all for me, but that's my email there. So if anybody has any further questions or anything, I'd be very happy to speak to anybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max. That's fantastic. And there's been quite a few questions come up, so we'll address those shortly after James has spoken. But thank you, everyone, keep them coming. I haven't had questions, and it was great to hear about the scheme in context from what you've done with your family farm. Our final presenter today is Dr. James Sipo, who's a research scientist in sediment geochemistry at Southern Cross University. His PhD research looked at carbon cycling and sequestration in coastal vegetated ecosystems, blue carbon, and impacts on these systems from climate change. James has recently been working with the Australian Government Clean Energy Regulator and Australia's leading blue carbon researchers to build a national carbon credits calculator for coastal land. James is also running a Regen Ag unit through Southern Cross University, which brings together experts in the regenerative agricultural movement. Today, James will discuss ideas on carbon cycling and credits in grazing systems. Thank you very much, James. Over to you.
Cool, thank you. All right. How's that? Can you see that?
Yeah, all good. Great.
All right. Well, firstly, thanks both Max and Lorraine. That was super interesting, and my talk's pretty different. So I'm looking forward to having a chat at the end. You definitely raised a few ideas that, yeah, you're working in a very different aspect of this, but it's really exciting. And I think it highlights that basically this stuff is super important. We need to get funding for better management of land, basically. We need to get funding for biodiversity, and we need to get funding to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So I've been looking at really nuts and bolts stuff with the carbon cycling, and I'll discuss some of that because I think it's good to have a bit of a background info on carbon cycling and how the carbon credits system works from the government side of things. But then, it'll be good to kind of loosen up that framework and talk just about credits in general with you guys at the end. So today I want to talk about some kind of finer details of soil carbon cycling, highlight some research, which I think is essential to be done before we can really get our head around credits in grazing systems, and also talk about some of the potential and show you some preliminary numbers that I've kind of just, some back of the envelope calculations I've done. All right, so first of all, I'll just start with some of the basic stuff. So basically, I am seeing a carbon credit in a grazing system as this balance between photosynthesis, drawdown from the atmosphere, and respiration of that organic matter from the soil. So when you basically pull from the atmosphere that organic carbon, what transforms it, it goes into the soil, but it's oxygen and microbes that transform it back into CO2. And that's super important. Basically forming the foundation of this this balance. What's left in that balance is what is stored in the soil. And today, I guess I want to talk about two carbon pools in the soil. So that's the surface stuff, and then potentially deeper soil carbon. Looking at a farm landscape, we have quite a few pathways of greenhouse gas exchange that we would consider when we're making a full carbon budget for a farm. And I guess I just made it a little bit more complicated because, so this year I worked on a big Excel model, and it's for coastal land, but it's coastal agricultural land, and looking at credits that you get when you flood that coastal agricultural land with seawater. So we've looked at all these kind of pathways already, and I know that this is the process that the government would take. So what you were talking about, Max, is definitely a different process of carbon credits. The process that I'm looking at here is really the carbon credit that you would get from a government calculator, and it's definitely more regulated than the way that other people are getting credits. And I think there's pros and cons to that regulation, right? So, but in carbon, it's really important that that the actual full carbon budget of a farm is considered, because if because we want to make sure that the changes are real and that are taking everything into account, really. The monetary value of those changes is something that could be flexible, I think. So basically in a farmland, you're getting drawdown of, so in pasture, you're getting drawdown through the grass of atmospheric CO2, storage in your surface sediment, and you're getting respiration from that sediment. So the things that we took into account for this calculator we made, blue carbon calculator, were fuel use of farm management. You would also need to take into account methane emissions from ruminants. So basically CO2 and drawdown and respiration just balance each other out, and there's no net difference, in a day-to-day situation. But when that carbon dioxide that turns into organic matter is then turned into methane, there's a net increase, which is basically methane warms the atmosphere 28 times more than CO2. So that shift in chemistry has an important implication. And nitrous oxide doesn't play directly into the carbon cycle, but it would be something that's accounted for in farmland, because you're looking at the net greenhouse gas inventory of a parcel of land. So if you've got emission, so you do get emission of nitrous oxide from soil if you add fertilizer, if you add nitrogen-based fertilizer. And that has a really high greenhouse gas footprint, 298 times of CO2. Saturated land that's saturated with water releases methane as well. Whether or not that gets included is kind of dependent on the politics of the government at the time. So on the model that we just built, we did include this, but then the government kicked out methane from drains and things like that, because it didn't kind of fit with the current politics, really. So the storage of carbon in your surface sediment, so say to 15 centimeters depth, or that's just an arbitrary figure, but basically wherever you have oxygen getting to, is probably going to follow a trend similar to climate. So every year we have climatic variability. We have an annual cycle of temperatures. So this is a figure that I pulled from a paper from Harris et al. It's a Nature paper, and it's a great way to kind of see climate variability. So basically we have natural annual variability. You overlay that variability with the short-term weather events, which is the second line down, the red line. You overlay that with climate change, which is a gradual change in the trend. And your result is something, this is a conceptual model, so there's no numbers on the y-axis, but the result is what you get right down the bottom, experienced weather. So you're getting annual trends with spikes and troughs occurring, and that gradual trend of increasing intensity, basically, in weather events. So I anticipate that the carbon in your surface sediments will follow a very similar trend. If you have a drought, you're getting lots of oxygen getting down into your soil. You're going to get microbes consuming all that organic matter and releasing it. So when your grass all dries out and the dirt is dry, it's definitely going to release a lot of that carbon back as CO2. And that's something important to consider in agricultural systems, and for people who are trying to pay for credits, is that it's what I would call permanence. But I think there are ways to get around that, and so I'll talk a bit about that. Some of the research questions that I have are down profile carbon transport. So carbon that is produced by grassroots is really labile, which means it's really available to little microbes to basically eat it and breathe it out as CO2. It's going to transform quickly. So what proportion of that carbon in surface sediments makes it deeper into the soil profile where it may have a better chance of storage? And what are the factors that influence that rate? So I think at the moment, I haven't seen a single paper looking at kind of transport of organic carbon down the soil profile and in a grazing system. There was one that I saw, I wouldn't pronounce the name, Torges et al. 2019. So in a cropping system in the US, which showed that if you irrigate crops after they've had good growth, then you will increase the dissolved organic carbon getting down deeper into your soil profile. So that is something that would be really important to know, basically. I'm interested in that question. There's lots of different ways, things that would influence that. So the grass species, the depth of roots, the grazing regime, obviously. There's other things like the mineral components in the soil. So organic carbon binds with iron in sediments and makes it less available to microbes. So looking at soil amendments with different, naturally, so iron is more available in basalts and things like this. You might be able to amend soils in quite a simple, natural way that would increase that carbon sequestration. Or maybe different land areas would have better potential than others. And looking at other soil amendments, biochars, etc., definitely would have, basically what you want to do is make that organic carbon less labile, make it more resistant to microbes and or transport it, processes that transport it into the soil profile. Another thing to consider, so when you're looking at a model, is abatement. This is actually a really big part of the model that I just built. So abatement is avoided emissions of greenhouse gases or avoided erosion. So you can get credits for basically turning off the tap on existing carbon loss from your farm. So that's an avoided emission, an abated emission. And that's how the blue carbon method that we just built works. A lot of the credits come from that. So basically by changing your land management to stop soil erosion and by changing the diet of your cows to reduce methane emissions, you should be able to get an abatement emission for those actions. All right, I did a few back of the envelope calculations. I basically used the model that we have, which is for blue carbon, but it is based on agricultural land. I added a couple of literature values from papers, and I've shown which ones. So I added a literature value from this Chaplot paper. That's a South African paper looking at high density, short duration grazing and how that influences soil carbon to only 5 centimeters depth. And basically getting 12 grams per centimeter per year increase. I pulled out this number from the IPCC of ruminant emissions. So that's what we used in the blue carbon model. That's the best we could find in the literature. So that's an avoided emission, potentially, reduced by on average 60%. So using this paper and some DPI values, so you can reduce emissions of ruminants by, say, potentially more than 60%, but the average value by adding seaweed and kelp to their food supply, which has additional other benefits, potentially weight gain. And this grazing soil erosion rate, which is from a Viscara paper that's also used in the blue carbon model. Basically, so what we're seeing with using these values, and this is back of the envelope, so it might not be exactly this, but with managed grazing only, we're only seeing about half a credit per hectare. With managed grazing and adding seaweed, so getting an avoided emission, you're getting about 1 credit per hectare. So that seems pretty low, right? And the CER, the Clean Energy Regulator, the value that they put on a carbon credit is fixed, and it's $17 a credit. So that is completely different ballgame to what you were just talking about, Max. And you would need a really large land area to make this an important part of your farm. I expect it would, it does seem very low, but if you compare it to mangroves, so mangroves have meters deep soil storage because they're saturated by seawater, which stops that carbon being released by microbes. You're getting like maximum 15 credits per hectare for a mangrove forest. So while it seems low, I think it's actually ballpark realistic. The only thing that I think really needs to be negotiated is the funding of that, because I think it's an essential process. It's essential for farmers to make these changes. So there needs to be enough financial backing to make that happen. So some additional things, it's kind of an overview, but I'm actually going to add a few new concepts. So we need to maximize potential for large area farms with poor grazing management to convert to better carbon management, which is not just carbon, obviously it's biodiversity, it's water quality, it's nutrient retention, it's all of the additional benefits. We need to maximize monetizing better land management. Permanence, so that permanence concept where you have annual variability with extreme events and things like that. Someone put a question up about what if you get a fire through a property. I think the same goes here. Permanence is really important, and it's a challenge for credits. So the CER has basically a policy that if you are in the negative, you get 0, and you will never have to back pay. You'll never have to pay the CER money, but they won't pay you a credit if you have an event like a fire go through. But permanence in this situation, I think the way to manage that is to have a modeled approach. So the method that we've built is based on literature values. It's not based on what you get from your farm. It's not based on taking measurements on the farm and getting a credit for that. It's based on what happens on average when farmers make this change, and you use the literature to back that. And then the government pays credits knowing that on average, all the farms are going to be different. Every year is going to be different. Every day, every time you take a sample, it's going to be different. But the end result of everyone managing their farm with better grazing management practices, better land management, will be taking a net amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. And the government or large scale regional councils can invest in that change. So that's the way I think permanence can be dealt with, by using modeled approaches rather than on-farm approaches. I think it's really important to be able to stack credits with other income streams, and it was really cool to hear about other types of biodiversity credits and ecosystem species credits, and to stack those together. Cool, that's it from me. Happy to have a chat with you all. So stop sharing.
Thank you very much, James. That was really fascinating. What a great insight into I guess a lot of the science behind what's actually happening, which was really insightful. So thank you. We've got quite a few questions, which are great. So I'll nominate which presentation they came up in, but all panelists, please feel free to contribute to this discussion. So first up, from Kirsty Cooper, of the Environmental Policy Manager at Australian Pork. And this was during your presentation, Lorraine. Are these credits from the EPBC scheme or state schemes?
Sorry, what was her question? Is it what or state?
EPBC.
No, they're state schemes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And they're different in every state. So what
Okay.
I was referring to was the New South Wales scheme.
Okay, beautiful, thank you. Peter McFarlane asks, what happens if a biodiversity stewardship site is devastated by bushfire, exacerbated by climate change?
So part of the management actions is doing what's scientifically called a hazard reduction burn, which basically means just putting fires through every 5 years to de-risk the bushfire, the chance of bushfire, but also the Australian bushland is very resilient to fire. So they won't come out and say that this is, that you won't get blamed as a landowner for it. You just wait for the bush to rejuvenate, basically, I think. But yeah, there's nothing specifically written in the clause about, like if there's a bushfire, then you have X amount of years to restore it to how it was. That's not a condition. I think they understand that bushfires happen. We just try to reduce them. And actually we use fire as a tool more than anything. There's a lot of exotic grasses, for example, are very easily taken care of by just running a bit of fire through, and all the natives burst back. So fire's been more a tool for us, but we haven't been hit by a bushfire in that really bad way. So I'm not sure.
Can I just add something to that too, Max? I actually think you probably can get in more trouble if you don't do your reduction burns.
Correct.
And there's a very hot fire that takes out species. So it's not really about the fire, it's about lack of, doing those regular burns. And as you said, it's every 5 years. And does that, I can't remember, does that vary with country? Is it sometimes every 5 years, in other cases every 10? Do you know?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. So that becomes part of the management plan for that area of land, that you would have regular cool burning.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I've got one from Hope Evans in the Bundjalung Nation in Austinville. What about the ethics of not being able to move koalas? So farmers are being paid to allow the killing of koalas in place in the hope that they can attract koalas on their land.
It's not quite how the species credits work. So I would only be able to generate koala species credits if I did have koalas here. So we don't have any koalas, so we can't sell those koala credits. Yeah, if that sort of makes sense.
I guess it just doesn't seem like it's like in that instance, if they're not actually being replaced, though, they're just allowing the killing as long as someone else keeps them on their land. I'm just thinking about the ethics of it, because it sort of just doesn't sit right. If it's,
yeah,
I can get with bush and lots of things can be replaced somewhat, but ecosystems are so delicate and
yeah.
you can't. It's some rainforests you can't replace. So it's kind of, I'm just wondering about the ethics of it in that respect.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I guess the way it comes to a very difficult question of like, how do we make, is development necessary, or how do we make like the least amount of impact from development itself? And creating a system where at least offsets are happening, I think is a good starting point. Ideally, we'd have no development and none of these rare communities or ecosystems would be harmed, but I don't know if that is possible. So I don't know. It's not perfect, but yeah.
I think, Hope, I tend to agree with you. It's a bit of a development cop-out with the koalas. However, and the Pacific Highway is probably the biggest culprit of all. So do we not you know, have the development that's happened with the Pacific Highway. It is a huge ethical question, but it's better than doing nothing at all, I guess.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I guess it's the best thing that's available at the moment. And we're going to be working with landowners, but I think it's going to be a hard sell with some people still.
I think the other thing is I'm not sure what the ratio is now, but it certainly in the past has been 1 unit of area has to be offset by 3 units of area. So it's it's not a 1-for-1. It's like you're saving more bushland and more habitat than you're destroying in perpetuity. So
well, that's good.
Yeah.
But I think this is also where we can think about, particularly if we're dealing direct with companies and developers, is making sure we're only selling to organisations that we're comfortable that the work they're doing is right. If they're not, then don't deal with them. Because if they can't buy the credits, then they won't be able to get their project done.
Correct. Yeah.
I had another one from Peter McFarlane. I think this was around for you, Max, who manages the total deposit fund.
Not a lot of management required for those. They're basically just bought government bonds, and that's handled by the BCT, Biodiversity Conservation Trust. But yeah, it's just all government bonds from around the world. So not a whole lot of excitement there.
Okay, and Kirsty Cooper has asked, what have been your costs in assessments?
I'm not sure if this is different for up around New England, but in our experience, ballpark about 30 grand for an assessment. That kind of changes depending on, it can be less than that if it's, a bit of a smaller site, but ballpark. So it's a bit of an upfront cost, but one that has paid back to us. It's a pretty safe investment for us.
This was a question I had too. What happens if the property sells? Does the agreement transfer to the new owner? And are they bound to continue the agreement? Is there a way they can break the agreement?
No, they can't. The agreement is fixed onto the title once it's registered. So you'd sell the land with the agreement on it.
It works exactly the same as caveats. It's like a caveat on that land, if people are more familiar with the caveat system.
Okay.
Just interestingly on that, in the carbon credits calculator, so there's a permanence option that the landowner chooses, and it's like a contract that they go into. And if they choose, there's 2 options. One is 25 years, one is 100. So if they choose the 25-year permanence, they basically get 75% of the credits, and if they choose the 100-year, they get 100% of the credits. So there's incentive for the long-term contract.
Yeah, it's a great system. Yeah, I guess it's but I think that total fund deposit will stay with the land as well. So maybe it's a lifestyle block, or if 100 acres and you sort of do a bit of work, get a bit of money, live in the bush, I guess it is sellable like that. But yeah, it does, I guess, devalue the land a little bit, but where you are devaluing it because of that a lack of optionality, you've got that liquidity event. So that's the trade-off.
Can a government agency compulsorily acquire a biodiversity stewardship site?
The only way they could do that is if you don't do any of the management actions and fly to the Bahamas or something, because basically you just need to keep up with the work, and that's all pretty manageable and reasonable. So
can I just ask a question of Max as well? You commented that you did most of the work on that land up front, so you spent a lot of money up front rather than over every year. Yeah. Does that mean by doing that you got a financial return more quickly?
Yes, it does. It means that total fund deposit number is dropped because so the total fund deposit number, as you know, is just how they come up with the annuity they need to pay you. And if the work is less, then the annuity needs to be less. So therefore the total fund deposit is less. So then we get that money up front rather than waiting to be dripped to us over decades.
Yeah, okay.
Plus that has the added bonus of improving the quality of your land and therefore get more credits to sell. So, yeah.
And so, Max, what sort of period did that happen over for you? Are we talking 2 years or are we talking 5 here in your case?
It depends on the size of the site. Could be 2 years. Yeah, 2 years, I'd say is probably a pretty good ballpark.
But that's selling privately, not through the government system, basically, isn't it?
We have sold all our credits privately, yes. But yeah. The more work that you do, basically the credit score comes out with a denominator that's basically a risk factor. And so the more you can get rid of their high risk weeds, like lantana, for example, the more they're comfortable saying, you know what, this is actually a really good ecological community, have lots of credits.
So who's buying the credits, and how do they use that how is that beneficial to them?
So we've recently sold some to Lend-Lease, for example. So they're part of their development application for some development they're doing. Then it has a little appendix, which is the biobank agreement, which is the credits that they have bought from us. It happens instantly, basically.
Yeah, okay.
I've got a question from Joe Davey. Is there any government regulation around which parcels of land can or cannot be locked up under a biodiversity trust agreement because of the implications for future planning and development for the state?
Dad's just telling me yes, but that's red flag areas include koala habitats, but not in terms of, we want to expand Sydney's footprint, for example. Otherwise, we'd have conditions on us for sure, given that we have suburbs all around us now. We're to the west of us as well. So I can't imagine that there's anything, you'd struggle to go put one, just by the Western Sydney airport, I'm sure. Now, I don't know the answer to that, but not in our experience.
Thanks, Max. From Greg Colton, James, do we know what proportion of CO2 released from the soil is captured through vegetation ground cover, through photosynthesis before reaching the wider atmosphere? If so, does that give us an idea of ideal thickness of ground cover to trap harness CO2 emitted from soils?
Basically, I didn't explain it maybe, but I think what is in your soil is like a threshold, basically. So what is getting pulled down by plants and what is being released is in equilibrium. So they're basically balanced each other out. And then different land management practices will change that threshold, will change that storage. And then that threshold will move up and down with climate variability, with weather events, things like that. Definitely ground cover improves the storage. So basically the things that drive release of carbon would be, oxygen getting into the sediment and that enables the microbes to release it from the soil. They basically eat it, breathe it out, like what we do to carbon. We breathe out CO2, we eat it and breathe it out. But that variability, that threshold is going to be influenced by lots of different things. One of them is primary productivity, so the rates of growth and the amount of carbon that's just falling onto the ground, basically, or being released into the soil. But also how much moisture we can hold in there. You can't really put a lid on the soil using ground cover and stop CO2 getting out. It's going to get out. hope that answers it.
Jen Ringbauer asks you too, James, is there a difference in methane emissions from different grazing regimes?
Well, yeah, it depends on the stocking. So basically, if you have a grazing regime that can increase your stocking capacity, you actually increase your methane emissions. So, and I did see that comment there on that the seaweed addition to feed releases ozone, which is unfortunate. I did not know that, but yeah.
James,
Yeah, so
has there anything been done on the actual pasture species though? Because certainly some, they are saying that some pasture species such as your ryegrasses and your cocksfoots and your more improved species release more methane than some of our native pasture mixes where we've got lots of herbs and which is more balanced diet for the cattle.
Oh, okay. I don't know. Yeah.
There is.
I mean, that stuff's
So
super
you haven't
important.
seen any recent research on that? Okay.
No.
Lorena asked, is there scope in the management plans for the BSA for cultural burning instead?
Yeah, there certainly is. That's actually something we've been looking into a bit recently. They give you management plans that, particularly with the fire, that they're a little bit unrealistic in terms of they're a bit formulaic and they're not understanding of the natural environment and the conditions of the day and how similar ideas to cultural burning. So that's something we're sort of certainly trying to incorporate more, but yes, it's something that the BCT should be actually writing into agreements. We're just doing it because it's best practice, basically.
Great, thanks. Just got a couple more. So Elizabeth Mark said climate change will change the ecological maybe communities that grow in an area. How is that factored into the performance requirements and management plan?
Sorry.
So it's about climate change, ecological communities that grow in an area.
I don't. There isn't any long-term factors like that put into the management plan or the it does allow you to generate more credits in 10 years' time if your site is going well, but it's not. So we've got Cumberland Plain woodland here, which is rare. So if in 50 years that turns into more of a tropical climate, I'm not sure what would happen.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Hayden's put James, Max, Lorraine, great presentation. He's after some more information regarding all types of biodiversity credits to explore stacking and begin a land valuation. I'm not sure if you've got any more information on that. They might want to share with Hayden.
Yeah, I can post something in this group chat here.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Max. And Nigel Jones has also posted some great information. So we'll put all these links up on the website when we put our recording up as well. And
I've got a question for you guys when we get a moment, if we have one.
Yeah, go for it, James.
I guess because I didn't really know that there was much about like private credits. So I know that there's been some in, I knew there was some in carbon, but I wasn't aware of it happening in biodiversity so I've been talking with the clean energy regulator about biodiversity credits, and it's something that they've been talking about, thinking about. I guess the project that I've just worked on, it's so regulated, so when you're thinking about a carbon budget, a carbon credit that you get through CER, it has taken everything into account, and we're actually giving you a credit, which we're 100% sure it's like, what's the word? It's very likely that you've sequestered more carbon than what you're getting paid for. So we're taking the conservative approach. Basically, that's how the CER works. with private credits, it's like you can really just there's a lot more freedom. It's a lot looser, and I guess I'm quite wary of private credits because I see that there's definitely potential to get potentially paid for claimed end results that might not happen. So I know that in the US there's been like stuff with forestry claiming carbon credits that 30 years later they look and there's actually no difference, right? So that sort of thing is what happens with unregulated, with private investment into credits. But at the same time, you, Max, are an example of someone who is getting the money that you need to do the land management that you need to do to actually make it viable for you. So, I guess I'm seeing as well that there's this additional benefit, which is really important, where it actually makes change happen. Whereas what I'm working on, it's not going to be feasible for a lot of landowners because you need to have pretty specific kind of situation to make it financially viable. So I guess I was throwing it out to all of you. What do you think about private versus government regulated credit systems?
It doesn't, I guess, it's like interesting comparing it to what you're doing, because I hadn't considered it that private, given the amount of rules and management actions that we get. It certainly feels like we've got someone watching over us. But I think, there's definitely, you do hear bad stories about farmers who don't take it seriously. And they go out to the site and, like those forestry examples you talk about, and they haven't made improvements. Which I don't know the details of those and what becomes of those landowners, but I guess theoretically they could lose the land, and a more, someone better would take over it.
Because I don't know if it's the landowners actually, but more the overarching system. So like the amount of thought and care from scientists all around the country that have gone into this government model, it's like they've thought of so many things that I would never have come up with, and that's really my research focus. So I think the benefit of the government thing is that it's incredibly thorough, so that the landowners actually, they kind of, there's no way of them messing it up.
That's right, James. I think we saw this in the recent carbon trade that happened, that there is the potential, if that land doesn't sequester carbon, that they will be paying that back to the likes of Microsoft, because it has to stack up in an audit. And the only way in the soil carbon world you can do that at this point in time is through soil testing and registering with the ERF. With the biodiversity credits, I think it's a little bit of a different story. And the fact in Max's case of his location being right on the doorstep of major development makes him that much more attractive as a property for that to happen. But he still is following the exactly same methodologies that are set through the system, through the government system. It's just that there's two markets. There's the government market and there's a corporate market. But the way he's doing it is exactly the same methodology.
Cool.
And more rules doesn't guarantee that you get a better result in the long run. It can be just more rules, and people will game any system. So it's a matter of getting it as a general tendency towards, rather than something perfect. Because it's all about creating incentives to get an effect. So it's not as human behaviour. People will adapt, and if you look at what's going on with water markets, that's a bit of a heads up on where some of this can head.
And so, James, I think your thing that you put up there about modelling is a little bit wobbly and dangerous, because there's lots of talk about modelling, like estimates of potential carbon across various properties based on only one property being measured, and that's really
Well, to do modelling you need a pretty big bank of literature to go from. You can't model off one study. You need that's the challenge of it. You need good data to build a good model. But then the thing with carbon permanence is then someone's not going to get audited in the middle of a drought and have to pay back a bunch of money. Do you know what I mean? There will be this the overarching system will will sequester, and then individual landowners can have fluctuation. I think that's why in carbon and potentially biodiversity, I haven't thought about it much for biodiversity, but for carbon, I think it definitely is a safeguard for the individuals if you got the data to back it.
I think the biodiversity one is a lot easier and more straightforward to measure in some respects.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
And a lot more exact.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, thanks Max for sending through that link as well. That's now in the chat on Hayden's request, but I'm sure everyone will be interested in that. Yeah. And on this third and final of our Collaborating with Carbon series, I'd like to just thank everyone for your support. And we've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure you'd agree that it's just been a fascinating series to be involved in. And thank you so much to our panelists today, James, Lorraine and Max, and to our wonderful interactive audience. Very much appreciated. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Thanks guys.
Bye.